everybody. My name is Mike Siebold. I'm an advisor at FlowerHire. Today I get to sit with Jocelyn Sheltraw from Headset. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, Mike.
I had an allergic reaction. I was so excited you were coming. So if I sound stuffy, it's because
Wait, was it? Are you sure? Because I think you mentioned allergies, but I'll take the compliment.
I'm trying to keep up. How have you been?
Good. Busy. Traveling around like crazy.
Well, yeah. By the way, before we start, where are you going? Where should people seek you out? Where are the next places you're going?
I mean, essentially any big conference. I'm there, or Size speaking on a panel. Liz, our VP of Analytics. We really spread wide and are just trying to spread the good word of what we're learning. So Benzinga will be next, our cannabis conference next week, and it just keeps rolling from there. Hall of Flowers, you name it, we're there.
I was going to ask you, by the way, the people at home. There are super fans that have posters of who we are up on their walls, but a lot of people are kind of curious. If you could do me a favor and just explain specifically Headset, what you do, what you focus on, specifically what you do for them, please.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll start, I guess, with a little bit of my background and who I am and how that works its way in, because it's really a fun little story that I'm kind of proud of. But so for me, I'm our head of industry relations at Headset, and really what that means is I'm out in market and I'm helping with our brand awareness, market expansion. You perhaps see me on LinkedIn writing a lot about what it is that we're learning, and so I'm traveling around all around the country, going to different conferences, events, speaking on panels, and again, just really trying to spread an understanding of what we do at Headset. Because as I explain what we do, you'll see it can be quite complicated for the cannabis industry, just simply because it's so new. And so for me and my background, I've been with the company, I've been in the cannabis industry for 4+ years now. And prior to cannabis, I was working in the app development space since graduating school. I graduated college in 2007. iPhone came out July of 2007. A year later, this is when we started to see, mobile websites being born, apps being born, a bunch of different text message campaigns that brands were using to, drive customer acquisition, et cetera. And so I started working in that space. I'd worked for a couple different ad agencies over a 10-year period. So I've worked with like dozens and dozens of different kinds of apps. And I really was part of the birth of this entirely new industry that has changed so many aspects of our society and just how we as humans interact. It's incredible to think that our phones have just been around since 2007, and now how integrated into our daily life they've become. So anyways, I started looking at the cannabis industry 6 years ago, and I was like, all right, this is going to be the next kind of, journey, the next thing that's going to be a massive societal, global shift for us. So I was looking at it and I was like, all right, what would be interesting in this space? And then a colleague of mine, I was at this company Rubicon Project, and he's like, oh my gosh, my neighbor is Cy Scott, one of the founders of Leafly, and he's working on this really cool company, you got to hear about this. And so anyways, I ended up meeting up with Cy in San Francisco. He told me what he was building, and I was like, whoa, that is fascinating. That is going to entirely change the cannabis industry. And I want to be a part of this. And so I think a year later, everything ended up working out, ended up joining the team, and have been doing kind of some version of what I'm doing now. And so anyways, so what we do at Headset, so given that our founders, they're all Orange County natives. Actually, we all went to rival kind of high schools, and all went to Cal State Fullerton.
Locals.
We're all locals. But anyways, so they started on working on Headset as they were, departing Leafly. And essentially what they built is a cannabis data and analytics platform that's helping different parts of the supply chain. So very simply put, what the company does is the first piece of our business is supporting dispensaries and retailers. So what we do is we partner with the point of sale systems. So over this 8-year period since the company has been birthed, we went out and we connected our APIs, our backends, with 26 different point of sale systems. And then what we do is the dispensary gives us the API key from their point of sale system. We plug that into our backend, and it ingests all the point of sale data from whenever they started using that point of sale system. And then we essentially are an analytics in a box for the dispensary. So we break apart that data into all types of visualizations and reports that's really helping the dispensary understand their inventory, who their customers are. It's essentially helping them make more money, increase their margins, and just run their shop more efficiently. So that's the first piece of the business. And then what happens is that because we have all those point of sale connections, we're partnered with all these dispensaries that are giving us access to their data, we then go and we aggregate all of that data on the back end. So we're aggregating all this real-time data. We're cleansing it, as I'm sure you can imagine. You know, it's very cumbersome. It's a huge task to go through and just make sure all of that data that was input into the point of sale system is clean and it makes sense. And so once we hit a point of like a statistically sound enough sample size of data, it's like for any data company, you never need to see 100% of data, right? To be able to forecast that up or make an assumption about kind of what's happening as a whole. You really only need to see a percentage. Somewhere between 20 and 40% is where we feel comfortable. And then it gives us enough to forecast it up for the entire market. So then what happens is you can log into this platform and you can see everything that is moving in a dispensary all in real time. So as an industry, it's incredibly impactful because it gives us an understanding, because everything's changing so quickly. It's unbelievable how much changes in just a month-over-month period. There's so much innovation happening, so many new products. So as an operator, as an investor, as an ancillary company, you want to know, like, okay, what are consumers purchasing? You know, you want to know the why. Like, why do they like purchasing these products? And so that's essentially what we're doing. In other mature industries, we often are compared to Nielsen.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so, well, the interesting thing is you touched upon the first part about how you joined Headset, which is like serendipitously, you had an inkling, you had an insight, you had a feeling and a sensation that you're like, there's something that I connect with in terms of like thematically with cannabis. And that's pretty synonymous with most of the people that we speak to at FlowerHire, which is there's a family member or they have a colleague or a former colleague that works in cannabis, and it's intimate to them. If they smoke or they ingest these compounds in this wonderful plant, they have this visceral experience. The idea of it being a career can be very alien to them. The interesting thing though is even though people have that inkling and they start having a career in cannabis, what you're doing at Headset is specifically taking what has been a clandestine practice and you're actually creating a historical arc. You're actually cleaning the ways in which we're viewing data and you're giving us a perspective and a reality into something like, to your point, is expressly getting bigger all the time, getting more sophisticated and complicated all the more. But what you're doing is giving some semblance of a line running through it in terms of insight. Yep. And that's so consequential because cannabis is a really old practice, but a new science. And data and the sophistication that comes with that is so consequential. And there's not too many people in your field that do that in the space currently.
Yeah.
So it's wide open. So you are the du jour platform for most people. You are there's a huge deference to you and your expertise and your teams.
Yeah. It's and we're constantly innovating. It's like one of the things that we're working on right now that we haven't yet launched but are close to launching. It's like one of the biggest challenges for plant touching operators, let's say on the brand side in particular. It's like understanding your inventory sell-through in stores in real time, because it's incredibly cumbersome if you're a brand, if you're a salesperson, and you're just calling, stores, hey, how much inventory do you have left? Like, do you guys need to re-up?
Manual.
Yeah, so it's like we're trying to say, hey, look, we can use, like every other more mature industry, we can be using data and technology to facilitate that, and that's going to put ease on the supply chain, because especially through the pandemic, it's like, and this happened in many industries. You saw that there was a lot of purchasing that was based on the demand that was happening and these spikes in sales. But then as we know, like that didn't really continue, right? Like at some point there was, within a matter of 6 months, there was a peak where then you saw that there was a lot of stalled consumer demand. Peloton is a good example, right? They were sitting on years worth of inventory. Yeah. So this happened to a lot of cannabis operators, and obviously these are perishable goods. That was incredibly taxing on their business because they're losing out on that money and then having to go fire sell those products. Right. So what we're trying to say is like, hey, like, look, we need to be basing your buying decisions based off data, using technology to help kind of ease that. And retailers traditionally have been, that's been a hard conversation to have, saying, hey, because we have a platform that it's like you can share all that real-time sell-through data. And that was really hard 4 years ago. I would personally be going around to stores and saying like, hey, did you know you can share your data back with the brands? And they're like, lady, what? We don't want to share data with anyone. Like, we're not going to give you access to our data. Why would we want to give a brand access to it? Well, then fast forward, and especially through the pandemic, people are like, oh, okay, this is incredibly inefficient. We're losing money. All right. And now we've started to see that inflection point where the whole market is shifting. So I think probably a year, 2 years from now, we're going to start to see like using these systems is just par for the course. Right. Everyone's starting to see the benefit. But that's a very recent kind of change that we've been seeing.
Well, it's fun that you bring up, like, because last time we spoke, and for those of you at home, we did do this before, and there was sound issues. So, like, this is part 2. But the interesting thing is, last time we spoke, we talked about the macro climate, right? And the interesting thing is, if you go out to the gas pump or if you go try to stack your refrigerator right now, there's like hardcore inflation, right? There's a time and place where a lot of consumers have to be a lot more considered about the way they're using any sort of budget they have in any respect.
Yep.
Now, the interesting thing is you talked about this huge spike in demand during the pandemic. You know, the thing that happened that we talked about last time was we get the essential service designation, right? And in certain markets, not only did we have the designation, we had new models like drive-through and curbside pickup. We saw people being able to buy cannabis at a much more rapid pace.
Yep.
And the interesting thing about your data too is not just informing brands in real time, you also do a post-mortem like this, an analysis of declining growth in recent US cannabis sales.
Yep.
This is basically a post-mortem on consumer proclivity and a change in consumer palate that we look after the fact in terms of what happened with COVID. Is it all declining growth in every market, or is it specifically mature markets?
It's mature markets. So to summarize kind of what the findings was from this analysis and why we focused on this analysis, yeah, like you're saying, for the first 6 months of the pandemic, people were going out and they were panic buying cannabis, just like they were toilet paper. So you would see stores all across the country that would have these massive lines. You saw, people had just so much more disposable income. We had stimulus checks, we had unemployment.
Right.
People were at home, so they were, bored and just wanting something to do. And then 6 months into the pandemic, that all started to change. And then we saw, those spikes, those growth rates weren't happening anymore. And so then over this last 12-month period, we've had a lot of operators. You read it in the media, you see a lot of headlines, how much the industry is struggling right now and how much sales are declining month over month. Which is true, but we wanted to look into that because even though sales have been declining month over month for the last 12 months in most mature markets, actually all mature markets, other than new markets that have come online, Michigan, Massachusetts, cannabis is so new in those states still. They don't have the same, supply chain that we do. A lot of those states actually have supply shortages on the legal side, I should say. Whereas more mature markets, we have just complete oversupply issues, especially in Colorado, Oregon, California. So it's a very different dynamic that's happening, which is also interesting because while we're, seeing inflation and, so many industries, cannabis, you're seeing prices go down.
Right,
because of
deflation, that's right.
Yeah, which is interesting. But essentially, so this is an analysis. So we're like, all right, we need to look into this. And essentially what we found is that even though there has been these month over month declines, the sales that we're doing on a monthly basis is still growing. So
overall sales are still up.
Sales are still growing. And so, it's like when we think about the industry, I think it's really important, like as I'm out kind of giving presentations and going through the data, and if I am just to isolate this 12-month period, I'm always conscious to say like, look, if we're just looking at this picture, then it's going to paint one picture of like a doom and gloom. And it's going to be like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. Every mature state is declining. And, operators were basing their forecasts off of seeing these spikes in sales. So now they're having to go back to their investors and being like, hey, well, the market has changed. But I think we have to keep a macro perspective, and we have to look at the growth rates over this 3+ year period. And, it's like when we take a step back and we look at that, then we see that, well, number one, like cannabis, we're already in North America, $35 billion industry. We're on the heels of these major industries. Now, natural supplements in 2021 did $55 billion in the United States. Wine did $78 billion in 2021 in the US. Whoa. Beer was at $94 billion. So if you just take a step back and we look at like, okay, well, imagine once we're federally legal. Imagine when we have a comparative dispensary to, citizen ratio like we do in alcohol, then we can only imagine how big that number is going to be. So my point, even though things are challenging right now, most of these mature markets are facing these oversupply issues, facing decreases in pricing, facing a growing illicit market. Right. All of that stuff is very challenging, but we can't lose sight of the big picture that this is just, we're a nascent industry. We're new, we're growing, we're going through these, challenges, but this is a massive industry that's going to be changing so many different aspects, whether it's like business or social justice or whatever it may be.
I mean, you bring up a good point, because like when you zoom in on, if you take us to the time and place right now, the severity, like if you're looking at a general graph that basically goes from the left all the way to the top right corner, if you zoom into a particular moment, there's a huge, concave versus convex growth curve, right? Like there are moments in time where it goes downward, right? And then it goes back up, and then it goes back down. The interesting thing about cannabis is a lot of naysayers about this space, it almost seems like this is like self-inflicted, like this is our fault, when in truth what we're trying to do and what you're specifically doing is trying to build, you know, a space and an industry in each of these individual markets without economies of scale, right? Yeah. But specifically trying to inundate people that you know you need a supply, or there's a huge demand, you don't necessarily know to what degree the supply is. So a lot of the markets that you talk about, it's not just an uptick, to your point, it's also the fact that there's overproduction in many instances. Mm-hmm. There's also a massive illicit marketplace that's responsible mm-hmm. for, I mean, I think we talked about this before, 3 out of every 4 purchases even yeah. now. And so we're stymied left yeah. and right, which also brings up kind of the next topic, which was regulatory hurdles. Yeah. You know, every business that we work with, you and I and the rest of the folks in this wonderful room, we work with people that have built cannabis businesses in a specific paradigm where technically you and I are aiding and abetting. When it comes to regulation, do you feel confident, maybe not in the imminent short period, like the next 6 months, but do you feel like we're at more and more of a tipping point where we're going to progressively get to a decriminalization moment? And more importantly, what do you think is going to happen after we decriminalize?
Yeah. I mean, to answer your first question, so I'm on the board of directors for the California Cannabis Industry Association. I'm also involved in 11 other associations around the country that mm-hmm. we're members of and supporting from Headset's end. And I'm active in those associations. I also try to provide a lot of those associations that are, you know, pushing some policy data that's going to be related to kind of pushing that policy. That's what a lot of our regulators and legislature, they want to make those data-driven decisions. So coming from that frame of mind, no, I don't think in the next 6 months. I don't think in the next year. I think, again, like this is a nascent industry with a lot of like preconceived notions about what cannabis is. And so when I'm going into meetings with policymakers in California, you know, it's always, it's surprising to me when there's still very much a lack of understanding. Yeah. I think a lot of the regulators that I talk to, the first thing they're saying is like, hey, like we see this is an economic opportunity for our city in a time which has become incredibly challenging. We don't have this other like, you know, light at the end of the tunnel. We see that that's the case with cannabis. I think there's a lot of data that's now starting to come out, especially in like Denver has released some data where it's like, you know, they find things like crime going down, or like insurance companies are decreasing their policy rates because they're finding there's less drinking and driving. So they're starting to make these assumptions and connecting it back into cannabis. So I think as more of that information starts to become available, and it's just like commonplace for regulators to be reading those reports and understanding all that, then we're going to see the shift. But what's happening right now is that it's just too new, and there's so much stigma around cannabis, and I think so much of it, and rightfully so, is focused on youth. That's a lot of the like pushback when we're in, you know, meetings with CCIA. It is around concern for youth, which obviously I share that concern. It's, you know, well, in my opinion, it's like, you know, we want to use cannabis to kind of come into consciousness in a sense, or we want to use it consciously, I should say. But I think what regulators will see when they look at the data, they're like, okay, well, you know, high THC levels or flavored products, like, is that going to be targeted to our youth? Are we going to have some concerns that arise that we just can't account for yet because this is so new?
Right.
So all that to say, there's a great deal of hesitancy from our regulators. This is certainly not going to be solved in 6 months. I think their initial interest is the economic benefit. Mm-hmm. But as they're exploring the economic benefit, it also comes with so many other challenges. And I don't think they really know. It's like a lot of enforcement budgets are getting cut from cities, right? So how do you then go tackle the problem of all of the illicit stores? How do you bring in unregulated operators into the regulated market when we are already seeing a big oversupply in license types? So it's just so new. We don't have enough time, you know, and like when I'm trying to think about, you know, my friends who particularly plant touching operators, it's just, you know, like enjoy the journey, enjoy the ride. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. We are just facing so many hurdles and education that needs to happen at every point, which is why, I don't know, I try to be out there and be like, you know, a vocal advocate for the benefits of it. And I think the more people that are starting to come forward and really share their personal story, it's going to help destigmatize the industry as a whole. Therefore, then it's naturally going to hit regulators to where they're like, okay, we can't avoid this anymore. We're going to have to pass favorable policy. And I think California is an example of that because it's just one of like, I don't know. And every market has its challenges with regulation, but California has had a lot of very vocal operators that are really pointing to regulators and to policy and saying this is not working. There has to be change. Otherwise, the unregulated market is going to eat away at the regulated market. Therefore, you guys aren't going to get what you want in return, which is making more money, et cetera, et cetera. So we just need to continue the conversation, but I do not think we're, anytime in this next year or two, we're going to see some instrumental shift.
Well, you talked about a good point, which is like the symbiotic relationship, which is you're specifically, you and Headset are bringing transparency to the process of this being built. You understand the regulatory hurdles and, more importantly, the regulatory implications, right? When you have taxes levied against every single part of the supply chain, by the time you get to point of sale, the idea of buying something in the legal landscape is really not as alluring. It's extremely cumbersome and it's expensive. And also, to your point, it's not very accessible. I mean, California has 1,000 retail and there's also illicit shops themselves, which sounds insane when you think about it, that there are actually shops out there with a front door where it's basically completely part of the illicit trade. I mean, in New York, where I just was, it's every bodega. And not only that, they have California-based products with RFID tags. Yeah. It's pretty mesmerizing, actually. But going back to the fact that a lot of younger folks, the idea of regulations and the regulatory hurdles, but more importantly, lawmakers trying to keep an eye on the way that younger folks are being inundated with information or education, or lack thereof, of cannabis. This is a young person sort of industry. Most people I come across are much earlier in their career, for the most part, the vast majority of people. There's another analysis that you folks did that I absolutely adored, which was about employee turnover in cannabis retail specifically. If you could, I know it's kind of I don't want to give a summary and I don't want to speak to the analysis, but if you could, I think the biggest issue, that's not necessarily in the report, is the lack of vivid cannabis cultures that are training and taking care and educating a lot of their work staff. But from this analysis, I mean, to what degree are we seeing turnover? How many good people that we're training or trying to train are we losing constantly? Yeah.
So for this particular analysis, we were looking at a time frame of, I believe, May of 2021 to June 2022. So in this 12-month period, we found that 55% of budtenders had turned over in that time. And when you look
one
at
out of every 2 person does not stick.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And actually, a quarter that started within the 30-day period had also left.
And what is that like in comparison to other industries?
Exactly. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported in that same time frame, or in 2021, it was 47%. And that's for aggregate for all businesses. I mean, I think the thing that we have to remember, it's like, that number seems really shocking, but it's like you're saying, it's like this is it's a lot of budtenders, a lot of sales staff, or people working at dispensaries, right? It's like you get a lot of people that are students, you got to get a lot of younger people, and you're just in an environment where it's like where they're at in their lives. Also, there's not really a stability, right? Right. And then the other aspect of that is there's just a lot of turnover. There's a lot of changing of hands of those licenses at this point. So you see a lot of different business owners that are owning those retail stores, and that can entirely shift a culture, a dynamic, right? You're having a new kind of managing team. So I think it's like really speaking to the fact that, yes, culture is incredibly important in this industry. It's probably like, this is a community of people, and you want to feel that through whatever business it is that you're running. I think on the retail side, it is one of those, parts of the supply chain that you do see a lot more of that turnover, simply because it's just a much more unstable environment. I see a lot of conversations, particularly on LinkedIn over the past couple of weeks, where, there's a lot of people saying, retailers aren't paying their bills, or there's a lot of blame on the retailers, right? That tends to be one part of the supply chain that they're always in the hot seat. But they've got a bevy of their own, issues to deal with. That's an incredibly challenging thing to run a retail store, especially for the dynamics that we're talking about, like the unregulated market. If you're going to be competing on price and, you're getting an eighth for $20 on the unregulated market, 2 to 3 times that on the regulated, you're still they're losing consumers. And so it's a very taxing environment for retailers. It's an incredible amount of pressure. Right. So I think what happens with all that pressure, it's just natural. It's like, human beings, like we crave stability. And when we don't have that, then it's really easy for our ego to get to us and to really come into play. And we don't act as our best selves and our most authentic selves. And so that's just the nature of that environment right now. I'd imagine as the industry matures a bit, as those dynamics that I just mentioned are kind of worked through, then we're going to see less turnover. But it's not, it's not instrumentally different than what we're seeing as a whole in the United States.
It's a little bit more, but it's not like it's not unbelievably more substantial here.
Yeah.
So it's kind of prototypical for this sort of role. I mean, the thing that's really interesting is a lot of people view retail. I had this conversation with a colleague who works in CPG, and he said, a lot of people at those positions, it's a gig. They show up, they punch in, they're there from 9 to 5, maybe they clean the storeroom, right? There's not really a whole lot of interest. It's a stepping stone, right?
Yep.
It's basically funny money to subsidize your life.
Yeah.
But in cannabis, the interesting thing is, and the implications is, these are opportunities. These are ways in which someone, as we speak, there is probably a budtender or someone at the retail level in a new market like Arkansas or Missouri who is learning on the job all the ins and outs and the implications of the space that in short order can propel themselves into general manager, procurement, even cultivation, all the way up into VP, EVP, even executive in short order. I mean, that's the thing that I try to emphasize specifically in FlowerHire, we try to emphasize, which is there's a tremendous amount of opportunity if there's a willingness on any person's part to want to contribute, participate, but to your point, be part of a larger community. I mean, the thing that we forget and that you and Headset do so well is you're disseminating best practices and information.
Yeah.
The hardest part for a lot of these markets is the fact they start up, it might be part of the Southwest, the Southeast. There are not a lot of places for them to turn for inspiration or information. They learn on the job. I mean, the question I have for you is, what are some good, besides Headset, what are some other good resources, podcasts, anything that you think would be good resources for people to get inundated with more facts, more info, more insight, more mentorship?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so many. I mean, that's a huge part of my day is actually just listening, because we're such a community and there's so much tribal knowledge that we have to take in that you have to kind of read these different publishers and then be able to read between the lines. So some of this stuff, I mean, MJ Biz, New Frontier, their podcasts like Sai, our founder, and Emily Paxia from Poseidon, they have a podcast called High Rise, and they're going through every week just like providing conjecture on kind of the top things that are going on that week and trying to provide a data-driven view. Rosie Matteo does a great podcast called From Pot to Popular, where she interviews founders and she talks about a lot of the economics of the business side and kind of how things are going. Those are probably the ones that I use the most. And then really it's just conversation. So that's why it's like I go to so many different events. I'm part of different groups like, Canapac, and we have like weekly meetings where everyone's getting together and just kind of providing conjecture.
What is Canapac? I think that could be a good resource for a lot of people.
Well, a lot of people ask about this. And so how this started, so Ray Navis, who's also an executive recruiter for the industry, at the start of the pandemic, where like this was the very start, he had invited like 20 to 30 industry thought leaders together to a Zoom meeting. And I had joined on the first one, and I was going over what we were seeing from Headset's end a few weeks into the pandemic and what were those sales trends that we were seeing. And we all just learned so much just sharing within this kind of closed group of being like, well, what are you seeing in your business? And what are you seeing in your business? That we all were like, oh my God, this is so valuable, that we just kept coming back every single week for a year. And then we're like, hey, like, the world is open again. Let's meet in person. And then we met in person, the group expanded to 80 people, and then it just kind of kept expanding from there. It's very much, it is a closed group in a sense, where it's like a lot of, plant touching operators, it's a lot of entrepreneurs and executives. But what I think people can take from it is just like, it speaks to the power of community. It speaks to how important it is to be getting the people that you need to be talking to and sharing insights. This industry and people are so much more open than we think. And so, to answer your original question, like what sources do I use? It's like, reading the media and understanding, different data companies and all those insights, that is so incredibly valuable. However, if you don't have the like boots on the ground understanding of this industry, it can be very misguided.
Yes.
So you really have to have both of those aspects in order to have a really like full, accurate picture of what's happening. Otherwise, you just, you know, it's going to be one-sided. It's going to be biased.
Right. You just go into something that you have misconceptions, and then if you're interested in having a career or even starting a business, you're not making a calculated risk. You're just inheriting the risk.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, it's kind of interesting. I think a lot of people out there, a lot of entrepreneurs, there's so many new markets that are trending towards adult use. I mean, on the ballot in November, I think there are 5 for adult use and 1 for medical, if I remember correctly. And there are a lot of people that reach out to us that are soliciting saying, I would love to get involved in this space. I have an idea, or I want to be a retailer. They're getting information, they're getting data, they're getting insights. The problem is, and to your point, they need to specifically get calibrated by collaborating with people, right? Not just reading something in abstract, but having conversations, working through and with different sorts of groups from that have insights into regulatory insights, working through any sort of consortium of person that can talk about the skills, the disciplines. And to your point, people are open to sharing those things. There's a lot of like, oddly enough, it's like co-opetition, right? Like, seemingly you would think that people are in competition with one another, but if you were a retailer in Florida and you are opening a place in South Dakota, you are not going to overlap.
Yeah.
For the time being, you're not going to overlap.
No, it's funny you're saying this. So I was talking to Gary Allen, who's the CEO of New Frontier Data this morning, and we're giving a joint presentation at Cannabis Conference in Vegas next week. And that was like the first thing we're discussing. We're like, it's so funny because like the industry deems us as competitors, yet we are very much like, we want to set the tone that like, no, like we're not competitors. We're actually like trying to partner with each other, and we're very much friends and sharing insights. And so, but we want to be that like testament or that proof point, like, hey, look, even though if someone's playing in your same field, data meaning, or data software, there's still so much more opportunity, and just kind of the mindset of like, you know, rising tide lifts all boats. Like it really is true. It's like, because this is such a nascent industry, we're all building this together. The more people that are out talking about data and normalizing data, the better it is for us. So it's just, you know, it's that, yeah, that spirit of, you know, cooperation. It's just so important right now.
It is that early where you have to depend on other people's, even though you might do the same sort of work, you have different vantage points, you have different kinds of expertise, different insights. I think the one thing that I always kind of find that's, it's really intriguing and interesting is the fact that there feels like, to at first blush, a lot of people say, oh, it must be very cutthroat because you see all of these retailers being, you know, maximizing the fact that with, you know, not in my backyard NIMBY laws, you can only open in specific places. So inherently, you're kind of thrown into a situation where you go heads up with people literally down the street selling the same sorts of products. Yeah. But to your point, if we want to be a cohesive whole, if we actually want to call ourselves an industry, we have to start sharing best practice, and we have to be candid with the fact that we have to, more importantly, kind of forget the idea that we're at specific companies and we're part of a larger sum.
Yeah.
That's hard for a lot of people.
That's, well, and also, like, I will say that's easier for me to say because, you know, in data and analytics, we have, I don't know, 5 main competitors, really, if that. But then I think about it on the flip side, it's like we're talking earlier, the dynamic, let's just say in California, you know, there's 1,200 unique brands here. You're competing for less than 1,000 retailers' shelf space. That makes for an incredibly, you know, competitive marketplace. So you don't have as much of the luxury, kind of like I'm saying, where it's like, oh, look, spirit of cooperation. It's like, all right, well, if you're competing with, you know, hundreds of other flower brands, all in this particular like value segment or whatever it is, yeah, you don't have as much of that spirit. And so I get that. I appreciate that.
That's true. That's right. I think we live in a time and place where like some of us might have the luxury of that thinking. But like long-term vision, the hope is we can share best practices and we can perpetuate something that's far more transparent.
Yeah.
Before we go, before we go, how can the folks out there reach out to you if they have any questions, or any operators, entrepreneurs, people that can get more data and insight? What's the best way to contact you or the team?
Yeah, so for me personally, you can reach out on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. I try to be, you know, as responsive as possible to all the messages, so it does get hard. If you have like a specific data kind of request, and I share this with like, you know, as much specific kind of request as possible, just Jocelyn at headset.io. And then if you have like a general sales request, info at headset.io. We'll kind of point you in the right direction.
Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Everybody at home, thanks so much. A lot of fun. Till next time, take care. That's fun.